The trail of blood was what caught Bill Henderson's eye first, dark crimson droplets against the sun-baked dirt road. Then came the impossible sight, a tiny blonde girl, no more than 6 years old, staggering under the weight of a massive German shepherd. The dog's fur was matted with blood, one leg dangling uselessly, its muzzle torn and swollen. Yet somehow the child kept moving forward, her small frame trembling with each step. "Hold on, Rex," she whispered, the first words Bill had heard from Sophie Miller since her mother's funeral 8 months ago. The dog's eyes, though clouded with pain, remained fixed on the child's face with unmistakable devotion. As Bill rushed toward them, Sophie collapsed to her knees, still cradling the dog's massive head. "Please help him," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "They made him fight." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Riverdale, Montana sat nestled between Blackwood Forest and the jagged peaks of the Sapphire Mountains, with a population of just 800 souls. It was the kind of place where folks still left doors unlocked at night and everyone showed up for Friday night high school football games. The main street boasted a hardware store, a diner that had been serving the same blueberry pie recipe since 1952, and Martha Wilson's veterinary clinic with its faded blue awning. Sophie Miller had once been the town's little chatterbox, a bright-eyed child who'd ask a dozen questions before you could answer the first. That changed 8 months ago when the car her mother was driving skidded off Mountain Pass Road during a spring storm. Abigail Miller died on impact. Sophie, strapped in her booster seat, survived with barely a scratch, at least not one you could see. The little girl hadn't spoken a word since. Not to her Uncle Frank, who'd taken her in, not to her kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Bowman, not to Pastor Jim, who gently tried each Sunday after service. Frank Miller, retired sheriff of Riverdale County, lived in a modest 2-story house at the edge of town, where the pavement surrendered to gravel and the forest began to reclaim its territory. At 58, his hair had gone silver, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, especially after losing his sister and taking on the responsibility of raising Sophie. 5 years before that, he'd lost his K-9 partner Duke in a standoff with a desperate man. Some folks said Frank had never been quite the same after that. The German shepherd that would come to be known as Rex had been born 3 years ago at a prestigious K-9 training facility in Oregon. With his intelligence and drive, he'd been marked for police work from the start. But 2 years ago, during a training exercise, Rex had vanished. The official report said he'd bolted after a deer, but the trainers knew better. Someone had taken him a dog worth thousands, with instincts that could be corrupted for darker purposes. Calvin Reed's hardware store stood at the center of Main Street, its owner a pillar of the community, a deacon at First Baptist, and the head of the Chamber of Commerce. Nobody would have guessed what happened in the abandoned logging camp 10 miles into Blackwood Forest every third Saturday of the month. The chain snapped on Rex's third attempt. After 2 years of fighting, of being starved to make him mean, of being beaten when he refused, something in him finally broke free along with that rusted metal link. The men had been careless that night, too much whiskey, too much money changing hands after his last victory. They'd left him chained outside the old logging camp instead of locked in the reinforced crate. Blood dripped from his muzzle where the Rottweiler had nearly torn his lip off. His front left leg throbbed with each heartbeat, probably broken from being slammed against the fighting pit wall. But Rex had one thought pulsing through his pain-fogged mind: run. He limped through the forest, instinct driving him away from the smell of cigarettes and alcohol, away from the shouts of men and the whimpers of other dogs. Each step was agony. Twice he collapsed, his powerful body betraying him. Twice he forced himself up again. The forest grew denser, the undergrowth tearing at his wounds. When the first light of dawn filtered through the pine trees, Rex could go no further. He dragged himself beneath a thicket of wild blackberry bushes and surrendered to unconsciousness. Sophie Miller knelt in a patch of wildflowers, her small fingers carefully selecting purple cone flowers and black-eyed Susans for the mason jar beside her. Uncle Frank had dropped her at the edge of the meadow with a promise to return after checking his fishing lines at Crescent Creek. "You stay right in this meadow. Soph, don't you go wandering into those trees, you hear?" he'd instructed, receiving only a solemn nod in response. The morning sun warmed her shoulders as she worked, her stuffed dog Buddy propped against the jar as a silent supervisor of her flower gathering. A butterfly with orange-tipped wings landed on a nearby thistle, and Sophie smiled a rare expression these days. The snap of a twig caught her attention. Sophie froze, her eyes scanning the tree line. There, beneath the shadowy canopy of a blackberry thicket, something moved. Curiosity overcame caution as she crept closer. Buddy clutched to her chest. A low whimper stopped her 3 feet from the bushes, dropping to her knees. Sophie peered into the shadows. 2 amber eyes stared back at her, filled with a pain that struck a chord in her silent heart. It was a dog, the biggest dog she'd ever seen, lying in a pool of dark liquid that Sophie somehow knew was blood. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the wounded animal and the wounded child. Then the dog tried to rise, only to collapse with a yelp that made Sophie's heart squeeze. Without thinking, she reached out one small hand. "It's okay," she whispered, the words feeling strange in her long, unused throat. The dog's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice. Despite his injuries, despite what humans had done to him, something in the gentleness of this small human called to something deep in Rex's memory before the fighting pits, before the pain, a time when humans had meant kindness. Sophie's pink backpack held her lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a juice box and a small first aid kit Uncle Frank insisted she carry. With trembling fingers, she unzipped the kit and pulled out the water bottle and bandages. "You're hurt bad," she murmured, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I can help." Rex watched as she poured water onto her hand and offered it to him. His tongue, dry and swollen, lapped weakly at the moisture. Something inside him recognized this child as different from the men who had hurt him. He allowed her to press a bandage against the worst of the gashes on his side. Sophie knew the dog needed more help than she could give with Band-Aids and water. Uncle Frank would know what to do, but he wouldn't be back for hours, and the dog's breathing was becoming more labored. "I have to get you to Dr. Martha," she decided aloud. "She fixes animals." But the dog couldn't walk that much was clear from his failed attempts to stand. Sophie bit her lip, thinking hard. Then, with determination that belied her small frame, she positioned herself beside the massive animal. "You have to help a little," she told him. "Just a little." What happened next would later be described by Dr. Martha as a miracle of pure stubbornness. Sophie somehow coaxed the 100-pound German shepherd to drape across her back, his front paws over one shoulder, his rear legs over the other, his belly pressed against her narrow shoulders, nearly driving her into the dirt. but Sophie planted her feet, adjusted her stance like she'd seen weightlifters do on TV, and took one staggering step forward. "We can do this," she whispered to the dog, to herself. "One step at a time." And so began the journey that would change everything in Riverdale. The first quarter-mile nearly broke Sophie. Every muscle in her small body screamed in protest as she staggered forward, the weight of the German shepherd threatening to crush her with each step. Twice she collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, the dog whimpering as he was jostled. Twice she forced herself back up, gritting her teeth with determination that seemed impossible in one so young. "My mama said Miller women don't quit," Sophie whispered to the dog. "Never, ever." The words hung in the air between them, extraordinary not just for their sentiment, but for their very existence. 8 months of silence shattered by this moment of desperate connection with a creature as wounded as herself. Rex felt the child's strength flagging beneath him. In his pain-hazed mind, memories surfaced of gentle hands guiding him through training exercises, of praise when he'd succeeded, of safety before everything changed. Something about this small human awoke protective instincts that even 2 years of brutality couldn't erase. He tried to shift his weight, to make himself lighter somehow, though each movement sent daggers of pain through his broken leg. "You're a good dog," Sophie told him, her voice growing stronger with each word, as though rediscovering a forgotten muscle. "A brave dog. We're going to make it." A stream crossed their path, usually just a trickle but swollen from recent spring rains. Sophie hesitated at the edge, calculating. To cross meant risking a fall that neither of them could afford. To go around would add precious time and distance. "We can do it," she decided, speaking as much to herself as to Rex. She stepped carefully from stone to stone, her balance precarious with the dog's weight. Halfway across, her foot slipped, and for one heart-stopping moment, they teetered on the edge of disaster. Rex, summoning strength from some deep reserve, tensed his body to stabilize them. The effort cost him a yelp of pain, escaped his torn muzzle, but they remained upright. "Thank you," Sophie whispered, understanding somehow that he had helped her. When they emerged from the forest edge onto Creek Road, Sophie could see the Miller house in the distance, still nearly a mile away. The spring sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat plastered her blonde hair to her forehead. Each step became an act of pure will. "Just a little farther," she promised Rex, though the words came between gasps now. Bill Henderson had been driving home from his shift at the lumber mill when he spotted them, a sight so improbable that he nearly drove off the road. He pulled over, dust billowing around his pickup truck, and stared in disbelief at the bloodied dog draped across the tiny girl's shoulders. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered, recognizing Frank Miller's niece beneath the burden. "Sophie." The girl looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears and determination. She didn't speak, but her eyes pleaded for help. Bill approached cautiously, eyeing the injured German shepherd. Fighting dogs were known in these parts not officially, but in whispers and sidelong glances. This one bore all the marks. "I'm gonna help you, darlin'," he said softly. "But that dog might be dangerous. Why don't you let me—" "His name is Rex." Sophie interrupted, her voice hoarse but clear. "He needs Dr. Martha." Bill froze, astonishment overriding everything else. Sophie Miller was speaking, Sophie, who hadn't uttered a word since they'd pulled her from the wreckage of her mother's car. "Please," she added. And the simple word carried such weight that Bill found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided, "All right, Sophie, let's get Rex to Dr. Martha." Martha Wilson was just closing up her clinic when Bill's truck skidded into the parking lot. At 62, she'd been treating Riverdale's animals for nearly 4 decades and thought she'd seen it all. But the sight that greeted her little Sophie Miller cradling the head of a brutally injured German shepherd in her lap, speaking softly to the animal, stopped her in her tracks. "He needs help," Sophie said simply when Martha opened the truck door. Martha's practiced eye took in the dog's injuries, the broken leg, the torn muzzle, the multiple lacerations consistent with fighting. Her heart sank. In her experience, dogs forced into fighting rarely came back from it too damaged, too dangerous. "Sophie, honey," she began gently, "this dog is hurt real bad, and he might be Rex." Sophie interrupted firmly. "His name is Rex, and he saved me in the woods." Martha exchanged a glance with Bill, who shrugged helplessly. "She was carrying him, Doc." "Carrying him on her back for God knows how long?" The thought of this tiny child bearing such a burden across the rough terrain between the forest and town struck Martha speechless. As a veterinarian, she'd sworn to relieve animal suffering. As a member of this community, she'd watched Sophie retreat into silence after losing her mother. Now, here was the child, speaking again, those big blue eyes fixed on Martha with absolute certainty that she would help this animal. "Well then," Martha said, making her decision, "let's get Rex inside." As they carried the German shepherd into the clinic, Frank Miller's truck pulled up, his face a mask of panic that shifted to confusion at the sight of his niece. "Sophie," he called, hurrying toward them. "Bill called me. Said you were Uncle Frank," Sophie said clearly, reaching for his hand. "I found Rex. He needs our help." Frank stared at his niece, tears welling in his eyes at the sound of her voice. Then his gaze shifted to the injured German shepherd, and something flickered in his expression, recognition, disbelief. "It can't be," he whispered, studying the dog's distinctive markings. "That's the K-9 trainee that went missing from the Portland program. The one they suspected was stolen." The examination room at Martha Wilson's veterinary clinic smelled of antiseptic and dog treats, a combination that had comforted generations of Riverdale pet owners. Tonight, it was the backdrop for a scene that would ripple through the town for months to come. Sophie refused to leave Rex's side as Martha worked, her small hand resting on the uninjured part of the German shepherd's neck. The dog's amber eyes remained fixed on the child, even as Martha administered a sedative to begin treatment. "I've never seen anything like it," Martha murmured to Frank, who stood just behind his niece. "That dog should be aggressive, especially being handled while injured, but it's like he knows she saved him." Frank watched the interaction with a mixture of wonder and concern. His training as a sheriff made him wary of any dog with fighting wounds, but his heart couldn't deny the clear bond forming between his niece and this animal. More than that, he couldn't ignore the miracle of Sophie speaking again. "You said you recognize him?" Martha asked quietly as she prepared to set the dog's broken leg. Frank nodded, his weathered face solemn. 2 years ago, a specialized K-9 prospect disappeared during training in Portland. High-value dog, bred for police work. They suspected theft, but couldn't prove it. This dog has the same distinctive markings, that splash of white on his chest and the scar above his right eye from an early training accident. You think he ended up in a fighting ring? Martha's voice dropped even lower, mindful of Sophie's presence. The injuries speak for themselves, Frank replied grimly. Question is, whose ring? The rumors had circulated for years, whispers of dog fights held deep in Blackwood Forest, of money changing hands and animals destroyed for sport. As sheriff, Frank had investigated multiple times but never found enough evidence. The operation moved locations, used lookouts, operated on a need-to-know basis. Uncle Frank, Sophie's small voice interrupted his thoughts. Rex is going to live with us, right? Frank met his niece's determined gaze, those blue eyes so like her mother's. 8 months of silence broken by this sudden attachment to a potentially dangerous animal. He chose his words carefully. Sophie, honey, Rex needs to heal first, and we need to make sure he's safe to be around people. Dogs that have been through what he has, sometimes they have troubles adjusting. Sophie's chin lifted stubbornly. He won't hurt anybody. He's a good dog. They made him do bad things, but he's good inside. I can tell. The simple certainty in her voice struck Frank to the core. It was the same tone Abigail had used when arguing for lost causes, the same unwavering belief that goodness could prevail. Before he could respond, the clinic door swung open. Martha, your light was on late, and I saw Frank's truck. Calvin Reed stopped abruptly, his imposing figure filling the doorway. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the sedated German shepherd. What's going on here? Evening, Calvin, Frank said, straightening slightly. Something in the hardware store owner's reaction set off warning bells in his mind. Sophie found an injured dog in the woods. Carried him nearly 2 miles to get help. Calvin's expression shifted to one of concern as he looked at Sophie. Is that right? That's quite something for a little girl to do. He moved closer, studying the dog. Looks like he's been in a fight. Several, I'd say, Martha replied, her tone neutral as she continued working. Multiple bite wounds, some older than others, broken leg, torn ear, malnourishment. Shame, Calvin said, shaking his head. Some people are just cruel. He turned to Frank. You planning to keep it? Might not be safe around Sophie. Once they get a taste for fighting, he has a name, Sophie interrupted, her voice small but fierce. It's Rex. And he didn't want to fight. He ran away because he's good. Calvin blinked, clearly startled to hear Sophie speak. He recovered quickly, offering a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, aren't you the little animal whisperer? Still, your uncle's right to be careful. He glanced at his watch. I should get going. Just wanted to check everything was okay with the lights on so late. After Calvin left, Martha resumed her work in silence. But Frank's mind was racing. Calvin Reed's interest seemed oddly specific. His concerns about the dog too pointed. Or was he just being paranoid? Years as sheriff had taught him to question coincidences, and finding a fighting dog the same day Calvin Reed made an unexpected appearance at the vet clinic after hours felt like more than chance. By midnight, Martha had done all she could. Rex's leg was set and bandaged, his wounds cleaned and stitched, antibiotics and pain medication administered. He's stable, she told Frank and Sophie, who had refused to leave despite the late hour. But the next 48 hours are critical. He's lost a lot of blood, and there may be internal injuries I can't see. Can we take him home? Sophie asked immediately. Martha and Frank exchanged glances. I think he should stay here tonight, Martha said gently. I need to monitor him closely, but you can come first thing in the morning. Sophie's lower lip trembled, but she nodded. She leaned close to Rex's ear, whispering something neither adult could hear. The dog, still sedated, twitched an ear slightly as if listening. I promise, Sophie said more loudly, straightening up. First thing tomorrow. Frank carried his exhausted niece to the truck, her small body finally surrendering to the day's exertions. As he settled her in the passenger seat, he noticed dried blood on her yellow t-shirt and mud caked on her jeans. The physical evidence of her ordeal hit him anew. This tiny child had carried a 100-pound dog through the forest, across a swollen creek, down dusty roads, all to save a creature most would have abandoned. You're something else, Soph, he murmured as he started the engine. Your mama would be so proud. To his surprise, Sophie responded, though her eyes were heavy with approaching sleep. Mama always said to help those who can't help themselves. Frank's throat tightened. It was exactly the kind of thing Abigail would have said, and exactly the kind of principle she had lived by. His sister had been investigating something in the weeks before her death, something she'd been uncharacteristically secretive about. The memory nagged at him as he drove through the quiet streets of Riverdale. Word spread through town with the efficiency that only small communities can manage. By morning, most of Riverdale knew that Sophie Miller had carried a wounded fighting dog for miles, that she was speaking again, and that Frank Miller was considering keeping the animal. Opinions formed rapidly and divided sharply. Have you lost your mind, Frank? Harold Jenkins demanded when Frank stopped by the diner for coffee the next morning. That dog could turn on Sophie in a heartbeat. Fighting dogs are wired different. Seems to me the dog's shown more loyalty than some people I know. Mabel Lewis countered from behind the counter. Heard he could barely walk, but still tried to protect the girl when Bill Henderson approached them. My cousin over in Millerville said they had a pit bull from a fighting ring that mauled a child. Someone else chimed in. Had to be put down. Sometimes kindness isn't enough to fix what's been broken. Frank listened to the debate swirling around him, sipping his coffee in silence. His instincts as a former canine handler told him that Rex was special. The dog's behavior with Sophie, despite extreme pain and years of abuse, spoke to an exceptional temperament and training that had somehow survived. But his responsibility as Sophie's guardian made him cautious. He couldn't risk her safety. Not when he'd promised Abigail he'd protect her daughter with his life. At the clinic, Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor beside Rex's kennel, reading aloud from a book about horses. Martha had reported that the dog had made it through the night without complications, a promising sign. Rex's eyes followed Sophie's every movement, his tail thumping weakly whenever she looked directly at him. Looks like you've got yourself a fan, Martha observed, checking Rex's IV fluids. Sophie nodded solemnly. He understands everything I say. Watch. She turned to Rex. Can you show Dr. Martha how you can touch my hand with your nose? To Martha's astonishment, the injured dog shifted slightly and extended his muzzle to gently bump Sophie's outstretched palm. Well, I'll be, Martha murmured. That's not just coincidence. He's smart, Sophie said proudly. And he remembers his training. Martha's professional skepticism wavered. In nearly 40 years of veterinary practice, she'd developed a sixth sense about animals, which ones were dangerous, which ones could be rehabilitated, which ones possessed that rare combination of intelligence and temperament that made them exceptional. Despite everything Rex had endured, she was beginning to suspect he fell into the last category. "Your uncle's worried about you," Martha said carefully, sitting down beside Sophie. Dogs that have been forced to fight sometimes have triggers things that make them remember the bad times and react badly. Sophie considered this, her small face serious. "Rex would never hurt me. But I can help him with his bad memories. I have those too, you know. About the car crash?" She hesitated, then added, "Sometimes I wake up screaming, and Uncle Frank has to hold me until I remember I'm safe. Maybe Rex just needs someone to tell him he's safe now, too." The simple wisdom in the child's words brought unexpected tears to Martha's eyes. "Maybe you're right, Sophie. Maybe that's exactly what he needs." Frank spent the morning making calls to his old law enforcement contacts, confirming what he already suspected: Rex was indeed the missing K9 trainee from Portland. A Belgian Malinois German Shepherd mix bred specifically for police work. His training had been nearly complete when he disappeared, with handlers reporting exceptional intelligence and a remarkably stable temperament. That dog was worth about $15,000, his former colleague told him over the phone. "We always figured it was an inside job. Someone who knew the training schedule, knew when the dog would be vulnerable." The pieces were beginning to form a picture in Frank's mind, one he didn't like. The timing of Rex's disappearance coincided with the first rumors of organized dogfighting in Riverdale County, and Calvin Reed had started his expansion of the hardware store around the same time, a surprisingly expensive renovation for a business in a small town. "Frank, you still there?" his colleague asked. "Yeah," Frank replied, his mind racing. "Listen. If I needed to prove a connection between a stolen police dog and a fighting ring, what would I need? Physical evidence linking the dog to the fights, testimony from witnesses, financial records showing unusual cash deposits consistent with gambling proceeds." His colleague paused. "You on to something, Frank? Maybe. I'll be in touch." As Frank ended the call, his gaze fell on a framed photograph of Abigail smiling, vibrant, full of the fierce determination that had made her such a respected journalist. She'd been working on a story before the accident, something local. She'd been excited about it, told him it could change everything, but wanted to gather more evidence before sharing details. The timing of her accident had always bothered him. A clear night, dry roads, an experienced driver who'd navigated Mountain Pass Road hundreds of times. The investigation concluded she'd swerved to avoid a deer, but Frank had always wondered. Now, with Rex's appearance and the connections forming in his mind, he wondered if her story and the dogfighting ring might be related. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Martha. "Frank, you need to come down here," she said without preamble. "There's something you should see." When Frank arrived at the clinic, he found Martha, Sophie, and Rex in the fenced exercise yard behind the building. Despite his injuries, Rex was sitting alertly beside Sophie, watching as she demonstrated something to Martha. "Show Uncle Frank," Sophie encouraged, her voice stronger than he'd heard it in months. She made a series of hand gestures, palm flat, then fingers pinched together, then a sweeping motion. To Frank's astonishment, Rex immediately dropped to his belly, crawled forward 3 feet, then rose and circled behind Sophie. "Those are police K-9 commands," Frank said. Stunned. "Advanced ones." Martha nodded. "She's been trying different commands all morning. He knows at least a dozen. Frank, this dog wasn't just in training, he was nearly finished. And somehow, after 2 years of God knows what kind of treatment, he still remembers." Frank knelt beside Rex, studying the animal with new appreciation. Rex met his gaze steadily, with an intelligence that couldn't be denied. When Frank slowly extended his hand, Rex sniffed it once, then gently placed his paw on Frank's palm, a trained greeting behavior for police K-9s. "Good boy," Frank said softly, emotion tightening his throat. This wasn't just any dog. This was an exceptional animal who had endured unspeakable cruelty yet retained his training, his intelligence, and, somehow, his capacity to trust. "Can he come home with us now?" Sophie asked, her small hand resting protectively on Rex's uninjured shoulder. Frank looked at his niece speaking, engaging, alive in a way he hadn't seen since Abigail's death. Then at Rex, whose loyal presence seemed to have facilitated this transformation. The decision crystallized in his mind. "Yes," he said finally. "Rex is coming home with us. But," he added, raising a finger, "we take it slow and careful. He stays on leash, sleeps in his crate, and we work with him every day to help him adjust." Sophie's face lit up with a smile so bright it almost hurt to see after so many months of silence and shadows. "Thank you. Uncle Frank, I promise I'll help with everything." As they prepared to leave, Martha pulled Frank aside. "I've been thinking about Calvin's visit last night," she said quietly. "Seemed mighty interested in where Sophie found that dog." Frank nodded. "I had the same thought. Martha, do you still have the clinic's security camera footage from last night?" "Sure do." "Why? Call it a hunch, but I'd like to see who Calvin talked to on his phone right after he left here." The security footage confirmed Frank's suspicions. Calvin Reed had made a call the moment he left Martha's clinic, standing beside his truck with an urgency that seemed at odds with his casual visit. Though there was no audio, his agitated gestures told a story of their own. "Can't tell who he's talking to," Frank murmured, leaning closer to Martha's office computer screen. "But he sure isn't happy." Martha nodded, her mouth set in a grim line. "What are you thinking?" "Frank, I'm thinking Calvin recognized that dog." Frank straightened, wincing slightly as his back protested. "And I'm thinking my sister might have been looking into the same thing before her accident." The word accident hung between them, weighted with new implications. Martha had known Abigail since grade school, had been among the first to arrive at the crash site that rainy spring night. She'd never quite believed the official report either. "Be careful, Frank," she said quietly. "If you're right about Calvin's involvement in dogfighting, he's got a lot to lose if that comes to light." Frank's phone buzzed a text from Mrs. Peterson, who'd agreed to watch Sophie while he ran errands. The message sent a chill through him. Someone asking questions about the dog, man in blue pickup, Didn't give name. I need to get home, Frank said abruptly. Now! Sophie sat on the living room floor, Rex's large head resting in her lap as she gently stroked his ears. The German shepherd's eyes were half closed in contentment, though his ears still twitched at every sound from outside. The security and peace of the Miller home was a stark contrast to the past 2 years of his life, but some instincts remained sharply honed. When the crunch of tires on gravel sounded from the driveway, Rex lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "It's okay, boy," Sophie whispered. "Probably just Uncle Frank coming back." But Rex wasn't convinced. He struggled to his feet, favoring his bandaged leg, and moved to position himself between Sophie and the front door. Mrs. Peterson, dozing in the armchair, woke with a start. "What's got into him?" she asked, reaching for her glasses. Before Sophie could answer, a sharp knock rattled the front door. Rex's growl deepened, the hair along his spine rising. "Who is it, Mrs.?" Peterson called, moving cautiously toward the entryway. "Jim Barnes, ma'am. Animal control." A man's voice, official sounding. "Got a report about an aggressive dog at this address. Need to do a welfare check." Mrs. Peterson frowned. "There's no aggressive dog here. Just a wounded German shepherd that the little girl rescued." "That's the one, ma'am. Had reports it might be a fighting dog. Need to see it to make my assessment." Something about the man's insistence triggered a memory in Sophie's mind, a voice she'd heard once before, in the woods, shouting for the dogs to fight harder. Fear flooded her small body, but with it came determination. She grabbed Rex's collar with one hand and her backpack with the other. "Come on," she whispered urgently to the dog. "Back door." As Mrs. Peterson continued arguing with the man at the front door, Sophie and Rex slipped through the kitchen and out the back. The woods behind the Miller property offered immediate cover, thick with spring foliage. Sophie had explored these paths hundreds of times with Uncle Frank, knew them like the lines on her palm. Rex limped beside her, somehow understanding the need for silence despite his injuries. They hadn't gone far when the sound of an engine revving reached them, someone driving too fast down the gravel driveway. Then Mrs. Peterson's voice, raised in alarm. "Sophie, Sophie, where are you?" Sophie hesitated, torn between returning to reassure Mrs. Peterson and continuing their escape. The decision was made for her when another sound reached the men's voices, calling to each other as they entered the woods. "The dog couldn't have gone far, not with those injuries. Reed wants it back alive if possible. Said it's his best fighter. What about the kid? Just keep her out of the way. We're not kidnappers." Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. They were hunting Rex, hunting them. She tugged gently on Rex's collar, guiding him deeper into the forest, away from the searching men. Despite his injuries, the German shepherd moved with surprising stealth, following Sophie's lead without hesitation. They reached Crescent Creek, its waters still high from spring rains. The bridge was half a mile downstream, but crossing here would throw off their pursuers. Sophie bit her lip, considering. The water looked cold and swift, but not impossibly deep. "We have to cross," she whispered to Rex. "Can you swim?" As if in answer, Rex limped to the water's edge and looked back at her expectantly. Sophie took a deep breath and waded in, gasping as the cold water soaked her jeans. Rex followed, paddling awkwardly with his 3 good legs. The current tugged at them, But Sophie kept one hand firmly on Rex's collar, and together they made it to the opposite bank, muddy and wet, but safe. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant. Sophie allowed herself a small smile of triumph as she wrung water from her shirt. "We did it, Rex. We—" The words died in her throat as a figure stepped out from behind a large oak tree. Calvin Reed stood before them, a leash dangling from one hand. "Hello, Sophie," he said, his voice friendly, but his eyes cold. "Looks like you and my dog got a little wet." Frank's truck skidded into the driveway, sending gravel flying. "Mrs. Peterson hurried toward him, her face pale with worry. "Frank, these men came saying they were animal control, but they didn't have proper identification. When I questioned them, they just pushed past me. Sophie and the dog are gone. I think they ran out the back when they heard the men at the door." Frank's law enforcement training kicked in, pushing aside the fear threatening to overwhelm him. "Did you see their vehicles?" "A blue pickup and a white van. No markings." Frank pulled out his phone and dialed the sheriff's office. "Dave, it's Frank Miller. I need deputies at my place now. Suspicious men impersonating animal control, and my niece is missing." He quickly gave the descriptions of the vehicles. "And Dave, they might be connected to the dog-fighting ring we could never crack when I was sheriff." As he ended the call, Frank's gaze swept the tree line behind his house. Sophie knew these woods well. It's where they'd hiked every Sunday since she came to live with him. Where would she go? Where would she feel safe? The answer came to him suddenly. The hunting cabin. She'd go to the hunting cabin. It was their special place. A small shelter about 2 miles into the forest where they'd spend quiet afternoons fishing and watching wildlife. Frank grabbed his rifle from the gun safe, not taking chances with his niece's safety, and headed into the forest at a run. Following the narrow path that wound between ancient pines and flowering dogwoods. He hadn't gone far when he heard men's voices up ahead, arguing. "She can't have gone far. Reed's gonna have our hides if we don't find that dog. Kid's smarter than we thought. Crossing the creek threw off the scent." Frank crouched behind a fallen log, his heart pounding. These men were tracking Sophie and Rex like animals. And Calvin Reed was involved, just as he'd suspected. Keeping low, he circled around, intent on reaching the creek crossing before confronting the men. Sophie would have headed for higher ground after crossing the water toward the hunting cabin. Calvin Reed's smile never reached his eyes as he approached Sophie and Rex. "You've caused quite a commotion, young lady. That dog is valuable property." Sophie backed away, one hand still gripping Rex's collar. "He's not property. He's Rex, and he's my friend." "Rex," Calvin chuckled. "We called him Killer. Earned that name, too." Rex growled low in his throat, recognizing the man despite the expensive clothes that had replaced the grimy T-shirt he wore at the fights. Calvin had been there, watching from the edge of the pit, placing bets and shouting encouragement as dogs tore each other apart. "Now, be a good girl and hand over the leash," Calvin said, taking another step forward. "I've got men all through these woods. There's nowhere to run." Sophie stood her ground, chin raised in defiance. "No, you hurt him, made him fight when he didn't want to." Calvin's friendly facade slipped, revealing something hard and dangerous beneath. "That dog is worth $5,000 to me, little girl, and I'm not leaving without him." As he lunged forward to grab Rex's collar, two things happened simultaneously. Rex surged in front of Sophie, his protective instincts overriding his fear, and a rifle shot cracked through the forest, splintering bark from a tree just above Calvin's head. "Touch my niece, and the next one won't miss." Frank's voice rang out as he emerged from the trees, rifle aimed steadily at Calvin Reed. Calvin froze, his face contorting with anger. "This is a misunderstanding. Frank, that dog is dangerous. A fighting dog that could turn on Sophie at any moment. I was trying to protect her." "Funny way of showing it," Frank replied coldly, moving to stand beside Sophie and Rex. "Sending men to impersonate animal control officers, chasing a child through the woods. You don't understand what you're getting into," Calvin warned, his genial mask completely gone now. "This is bigger than you think." "I think I understand just fine," Frank said. "You're running dogfights. You stole a police K-9 trainee 2 years ago to use as a fighter, and I'm betting you had something to do with my sister's accident, too." Calvin's eyes narrowed. "Abigail should have minded her own business, just like you should now." The admission, for that's what it was, hit Frank like a physical blow. His sister's death hadn't been an accident. The rifle wavered slightly in his hands as rage threatened to overwhelm his control. Sophie's small voice broke the tension. "Uncle Frank, there are more men coming. I can hear them." As if to confirm her words, shouts echoed through the trees, drawing closer. Calvin's mouth twisted in a triumphant smile. "Seems like we're at an impasse. Frank, you can't shoot all of us." "No," came a new voice as Sheriff Dave Taylor stepped into the clearing, flanked by 4 deputies with weapons drawn. "But we can arrest all of you." "Calvin Reed, you're under arrest for animal cruelty, operating an illegal gambling enterprise, and conspiracy to commit murder." Calvin's face drained of color as he stared at the officers surrounding him. "You've got nothing on me. Nothing." "Actually," Frank said quietly, "we have everything, including your admission about Abigail, which I just recorded on my phone." He pulled his cell from his pocket. The voice memo app still running. "And I'm betting when we search your property, we'll find evidence connecting you to the dogfighting ring and my sister's death." As the deputies handcuffed Calvin, Sophie knelt beside Rex, her arms around the German shepherd's neck. "It's over," she whispered into his fur. "You're safe now. For real." Rex licked her cheek once, then turned to watch as the man who had tormented him for 2 years was led away in handcuffs. In his amber eyes was not hatred or fear, but something that looked remarkably like justice. The examination room at Riverdale Animal Hospital fell silent, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Martha Wilson's hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her face betrayed her concern as she worked on Rex. The German shepherd lay unconscious on the stainless steel table, his powerful body suddenly looking vulnerable under the harsh surgical lights. His escape through the woods reopened the worst wounds, Martha explained to Frank, who stood at the doorway with Sophie in his arms. And the creek water introduced bacteria. He's developed sepsis. Sophie's small fingers clutched her uncle's shirt. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Martha exchanged a glance with Frank before answering honestly. "It means Rex is very sick, honey. His body is fighting a serious infection. But you can fix him. Right?" Sophie's voice trembled with fear and exhaustion. The events of the day, their escape through the woods, the confrontation with Calvin Reed, the arrest had finally caught up with her small body. But she refused to leave Rex's side. Martha adjusted the IV drip, delivering antibiotics and fluids into Rex's foreleg. "I'm doing everything I can, Sophie. Rex is strong, and he's a fighter, the good kind of fighter, but the next few hours will be critical." Frank carried Sophie to the waiting room, settling her on his lap in one of the worn vinyl chairs. Sheriff Taylor had taken Calvin Reed and his associates into custody, promising to keep Frank updated as the investigation unfolded. Already, deputies were searching Calvin's property and the abandoned logging camp where the dogfights had been held. "Uncle Frank," Sophie murmured, her eyelids heavy with approaching sleep. "Rex has to get better. He just has to." "I know, Soph," Frank replied, smoothing her tangled hair. "Doctor, Martha's the best there is. If anyone can help him, she can." "He saved me," Sophie continued, fighting to stay awake. "In the woods, when Mr. Reed tried to grab me. Rex got between us, even though he was hurt." Frank's arms tightened around his niece. The image of Calvin lunging toward Sophie would haunt his dreams for years to come. If Rex hadn't been there, if Frank had arrived even moments later. "That's what good dogs do," he told her softly. "They protect their people. He's my dog now, isn't he?" Sophie's voice was barely audible as sleep finally claimed her. Frank pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Yes, Soph, Rex is your dog now." 3 hours later, Martha emerged from the treatment room, pulling off her surgical cap with a weary hand. Frank, who had been dozing with Sophie still curled in his lap, came instantly alert. "How is he?" he asked, careful not to wake his niece. Martha sank into the chair opposite, her face drawn with fatigue. "I've done everything medically possible, Frank. The antibiotics are the strongest I can give. I've cleaned and redressed all the wounds, set up blood transfusions, started supportive care for his organs." She paused, rubbing her eyes. "But his condition is deteriorating. His body's been through too much, the fighting, the malnutrition, the injuries, the stress of escape and recapture." Frank felt a heaviness settle in his chest. "Are you saying he won't make it?" "I'm saying it would take a miracle," Martha replied softly. "His heart is showing signs of strain. Even if he survives the night, there could be permanent damage to his kidneys or brain from the septic shock." She glanced at Sophie's sleeping form. "I'm so sorry, Frank. I know what this will do to her." Frank nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. After everything, Sophie carrying the wounded dog for miles, finding her voice again, surviving Calvin's pursuit to lose Rex, now seemed an unbearable cruelty. "Can we see him?" he asked finally. Martha hesitated. "He's unconscious, on a ventilator. It might be disturbing for Sophie. She'll never forgive me if I don't let her say goodbye," Frank said simply. "Just in case." The monitoring equipment loomed large around Rex's still form, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that breathed for him, measured his vital signs, delivered medications. Frank hesitated at the doorway, wondering if he'd made the right decision in bringing Sophie here. The little girl had woken during the short walk from the waiting room, her eyes immediately searching for her dog. "Rex," she called softly, slipping from Frank's arms to approach the table. Martha moved to intercept her. "Sophie, honey, Rex is very sick. All these machines are helping him, but he might not. He can hear me," Sophie interrupted with absolute certainty. "Can I touch him?" Martha glanced at Frank, who nodded. "Just be gentle with the tubes and wires," she cautioned. Sophie approached the table slowly, her small face solemn as she took in the ventilator breathing for Rex, the IV lines, the beeping monitors. She reached out a tentative hand to stroke the fur between his ears, the spot she'd discovered he loved best. "Rex," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. "It's Sophie. You have to fight now. Okay? Not like before, when the bad men made you. Fight to stay with me." Her voice broke on the last word, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please." Frank and Martha stood in silence, watching as Sophie continued whispering to the unconscious dog, her small hand never ceasing its gentle stroking. The monitors beeped steadily in the background, measuring a life hanging by the thinnest of threads. After a few minutes, Martha touched Frank's arm. "His heart rate is stabilizing," she murmured, disbelief coloring her tone. "It was erratic before, but now—" Frank watched the monitor, saw the jagged lines smoothing into a more regular pattern. "Is that good?" "It's unexpected," Martha replied cautiously. "But yes, it's good." She moved closer, checking Rex's other vital signs. "His oxygen levels are improving too." She shook her head in wonder. "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 40 years, and I still can't explain some things." Sophie looked up, hope dawning in her tear-streaked face. "Is Rex getting better?" Martha hesitated, unwilling to offer false hope. "His signs are improving. Sophie, that's a good start, but he's still very sick." "He's fighting," Sophie said with conviction, turning back to the German shepherd. "Aren't you, Rex? You're the bravest, strongest dog in the whole world." As if in response, the monitor tracking Rex's heart rate beeped more rapidly. His tail, the only part of him not immobilized by tubes and restraints, twitched once, weakly. "Well, I'll be damned," Martha whispered, watching the monitors with growing amazement. "Frank, I've seen animals respond to their owner's presence before, but this—" Frank moved to stand beside his niece, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. Together, they watched as Rex's vital signs continued to improve, minute by minute, defying medical expectation. The German shepherd's spirit, so nearly broken by cruelty and abuse, seemed to be rallying in response to the pure, unconditional love of a small girl who had refused to abandon him. When Rex's eyes fluttered open an hour later, seeking and finding Sophie's face, Martha Wilson finally allowed herself to believe in miracles. Dawn broke over Riverdale with streaks of amber and gold painting the distant mountains. Frank Miller stood at the window of Martha Wilson's veterinary clinic, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. Behind him, Sophie slept curled in an armchair pulled close to Rex's kennel, her small hand reaching through the bars to rest on the German shepherd's flank. The dog's eyes were open, alert despite the trauma his body had endured, his gaze never straying far from the sleeping child. "It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen," Sheriff Dave Taylor said quietly, joining Frank at the window. He'd arrived at first light, grim-faced but satisfied. "That dog should be dead by all medical accounts." Frank nodded, his eyes still on the tableau of child and dog. "Martha's calling it a miracle. Says she can't explain it scientifically. Well, after what I found at Reed's property last night, I'm inclined to believe in a bit of divine justice." Dave pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "You were right about everything. Frank, the dogfighting ring, the stolen K9s, even about Abigail." Frank turned, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You found evidence about my sister." Dave's weathered face softened with sympathy. "We found a journal in Calvin's office safe, hidden behind a false panel. He kept meticulous records of the fighting operation dates, locations, animals, winnings, and he mentioned Abigail by name." He hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share. "She'd gotten photos, photos of Calvin at one of the fights. She was planning an expose that would have ruined him. So he had her killed," Frank said flatly, the words falling like stones in the quiet room. "He arranged for her brake lines to be cut," Dave confirmed. "Hired a mechanic from over in Millerville to do it, fellow named Rayburn, who owed him gambling debts. We've already picked him up, and he's talking. Says Calvin told him where Abigail's car would be parked that day at the newspaper office." Frank closed his eyes, grief and rage warring within him. All these months of wondering, of trying to make sense of the senseless, now, finally, answers, but they brought no peace, only confirmation of his darkest suspicions. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Now we build a case that will put Calvin Reed away for the rest of his natural life." Dave replied with quiet determination. "Murder, animal cruelty, illegal gambling, racketeering. The FBI's coming in today. This operation crossed state lines with the stolen K9s. And Rex," Frank gestured toward the kennel where the German shepherd lay watching them, somehow understanding he was the subject of their conversation. "The K9 Training Center in Portland has been notified," Dave said. "They're sending someone to identify him formally, but given his distinctive markings and your positive ID, there's little doubt it's their missing dog." Frank's stomach tightened. "Will they want him back?" Dave shrugged. "Hard to say. He's evidence in a federal case now, and after what he's been through—" He left the sentence unfinished. But the implication was clear. Rex's fighting experiences might have rendered him unsuitable for police work, regardless of his original training. A small voice interrupted their conversation. "Rex is staying with us." Sophie stood in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep, her expression fiercely determined. "He chose me. I chose him." Frank crossed to his niece, kneeling to meet her eyes. "Soph, Rex belonged to the police training program before he was stolen. They might have legal claim to him." Sophie's chin jutted stubbornly. "He needs me, and I need him." Frank glanced at Dave, who spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "She's got a point. That dog seems pretty attached, and after what she did to save him—" He smiled slightly. "I'll talk to the Portland folks when they arrive. Maybe we can work something out." By mid-morning, the veterinary clinic had become the unexpected center of activity in Riverdale. Deputies came and went, collecting evidence and statements. Martha's waiting room filled with townspeople bringing food, flowers, and well wishes for Sophie and Rex. The story of the little girl who had carried a wounded fighting dog for miles had spread like wildfire, captivating hearts and sparking heated discussions about animal cruelty, heroism, and justice. "Never seen anything like it," Mabel Lewis declared, setting down a container of her famous chicken soup. "That child's got more grit than folks 3 times her size." "Brave little thing," Harold Jenkins agreed, surprising everyone given his initial skepticism about keeping a fighting dog. "My grandson's about her age. Can't imagine him carrying a dog that size across a parking lot, let alone through the woods." Outside, a news van from the regional station had parked, its reporter attempting to piece together the story from eager locals. Frank had firmly refused all interview requests, protective of Sophie's privacy and mindful of the ongoing investigation. Inside Rex's treatment room, Agent Lauren Parker from the FBI's Animal Crimes Division crouched beside the German Shepherd's kennel, examining him with expert eyes. "The Portland Canine Center sent me his file," she told Frank and Martha. "There's no doubt this is their dog, Ranger. They called him one of their most promising trainees, specialized in scent detection and apprehension. His microchip confirms it." Sophie, who hadn't left Rex's side all morning, clutched Frank's hand tightly. "His name is Rex now," she said quietly but firmly. Agent Parker smiled gently at the child. "Names can change. Sophie, what matters is that he's safe now. Thanks to you." She rose, addressing Frank and Martha. "I've never seen a case quite like this. Most fighting dogs, well, they don't often get happy endings." "This one will," Frank stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Whatever legal hurdles we need to clear, whatever paperwork needs filing, Rex stays with Sophie." Agent Parker studied him thoughtfully. "The Canine Center has officially relinquished claim, given the circumstances. They've submitted paperwork designating him as a witness in our case against Calvin Reed and his associates." She knelt again, meeting Sophie's anxious gaze. "That means Rex's future is up to the court, and to the FBI's recommendation." "And what will you recommend?" Martha asked sharply. Agent Parker reached through the kennel bars, allowing Rex to sniff her hand. The German Shepherd did so cautiously, then gave her fingers a gentle lick, a remarkable display of trust from a dog who had every reason to fear humans. "I'll recommend that Rex be placed with the family that saved him," she said softly. "Provided they understand the challenges ahead. Dogs rescued from fighting situations need specialized care, consistent training, patience." "We have all of that and more," Frank assured her. Sophie nodded solemnly. "I'm going to help Rex forget the bad things. We'll make new memories to cover the scary ones." Agent Parker's professional demeanor softened at the child's words. "I believe you will. Sophie," she turned to Frank, "there's something else you should know. When our team searched the logging camp, we found records of every dog that passed through Reed's fighting operation. Rex Ranger wasn't the only police dog stolen. There were at least 7 others over the past 3 years, from training facilities across 3 states. Frank's blood ran cold. "Where are they now?" "Most didn't survive the fights," Parker replied grimly. but we found 3 still alive, kept in underground kennels at Reed's property. They're in bad shape physically and psychologically, but they're being transferred to our rehabilitation facility in Colorado. Because of Rex, Sophie said, her eyes wide with understanding. Because he escaped and found me. You could save the other dogs, too. Agent Parker nodded. That's exactly right. Sophie. Rex is a hero twice over, once for surviving, and again for leading us to the others. As if understanding the conversation, Rex thumped his tail against the kennel floor, his amber eyes fixed on Sophie with unmistakable devotion. The evidence from Calvin Reed's property yielded more than anyone had anticipated, in addition to the detailed records of dog fights. FBI agents discovered financial ledgers revealing a network that stretched across 5 states, involving dozens of individuals, some of whom occupied positions of considerable influence. This goes deeper than we thought, Dave told Frank 3 days later, as they sat on the porch of the Miller home, watching Sophie and Rex in the yard. The German Shepherd's physical recovery had progressed remarkably. Though still limping slightly, he moved with increasing confidence, following Sophie's every step. Reed was just the local operator. There are bigger fish involved: politicians, a judge in Montana, even a police chief in Idaho. Frank shook his head in disgust. All those animals suffering, all for blood sport and gambling money. And your sister stumbled right into the middle of it, Dave added quietly. The FBI found her research notes in Reed's safe along with the photographs she'd taken. She'd connected dots none of us saw. Frank watched as Sophie demonstrated a hand signal to Rex, who immediately sat, then lay down, then rolled over the routine punctuated by the child's delighted laughter and the dog's joyful response. Abigail would have been proud of Sophie, Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. Carrying that dog for miles, standing up to Reed, never giving up despite the odds. She's her mother's daughter, Dave agreed. Got that same stubborn streak of justice. As the men talked, a car pulled into the driveway, Martha Wilson's aging station wagon. The veterinarian emerged carrying her medical bag, followed by a younger woman Frank didn't recognize. "Morning, gentlemen," Martha called. "Brought someone who'd like to meet Rex and Sophie." She gestured to her companion. "This is Dr. Elaine Winters from the Canine Rehabilitation Center in Denver. She specializes in helping dogs recover from trauma." Sophie, spotting the visitors, ran toward them with Rex limping gamely at her heels. "Dr. Martha, is it time for Rex's checkup?" "It is, honey," Martha confirmed. "And Dr. Winters here is going to talk to us about helping Rex feel better on the inside, not just on the outside." Dr. Winters knelt to Sophie's level, her expression warm but professional. "Hello, Sophie. I've heard so much about you and Rex. May I say hello to him?" Sophie nodded, but placed a protective hand on Rex's head. "He gets scared sometimes with new people." "That's understandable. After what he's been through," Dr. Winters said, making no move to touch the dog. Instead, she remained still, allowing Rex to approach on his own terms. Dogs who have experienced trauma often have triggers, things that remind them of scary times. But with the right help, they can learn to feel safe again. Rex studied the newcomer warily, his body tense beside Sophie. Then, slowly, he stretched his neck forward to sniff Dr. Winters' outstretched hand. After a moment's consideration, He took a step closer, accepting her presence. "Good boy." "Rex," Sophie praised softly. "Dr. Winters is here to help." The rehabilitation specialist smiled. "He trusts your judgment, Sophie. That's a powerful bond you've formed in such a short time." As the adults moved inside to discuss Rex's treatment plan, Frank lingered on the porch, watching his niece and the dog return to their play in the yard. There was something profound in their interaction, a wounded child and a wounded animal healing each other through simple, unconditional acceptance. The evidence against Calvin Reed and his associates continued to mount. FBI agents had tracked financial transactions, intercepted communications, and collected testimony from individuals involved in the dogfighting ring. Reed himself remained in custody, denied bail due to the severity of the charges and the risk of flight. What surprised Frank most was the community's response. Riverdale had always been a town that valued its privacy, where people minded their own business and expected others to do the same. But something about Sophie's courage and Rex's resilience had struck a chord. Donations poured in for Martha's emergency medical fund for abused animals. Volunteers offered to help with the rescued fighting dogs, still recovering at a temporary shelter outside town. Even Harold Jenkins, once vocally skeptical about rehabilitating dangerous dogs, had volunteered his fencing expertise to build a secure exercise yard. "It's like that little girl and her dog woke something up in this town," Dave observed, voicing Frank's own thoughts. "Something that was always there but needed reminding." Frank nodded, thinking of Abigail, her passion for justice, her belief that one person could make a difference. She would have recognized this moment for what it was, not just the breaking of a criminal enterprise, but the beginning of a community's healing. As if reading his thoughts, Dave added quietly, "We're reopening the investigation into Abigail's accident officially this time. With Rayburn's testimony and the evidence from Reed's safe, we'll finally be able to give her justice." "Thank you," Frank said simply, watching as Rex gently took a frisbee from Sophie's hand, his movements careful despite his excitement. "But in a way, she already has justice. Her daughter is speaking again. The story she was working on will finally be told. And that dog," he gestured to Rex, now proudly carrying the frisbee back to Sophie. "That dog she would have moved heaven and earth to save is safe because of her daughter." In the yard, Sophie's laughter rang out as Rex performed an exuberant playbow, tail wagging furiously, a sound of pure joy that, until a week ago, Frank had feared he might never hear again. 3 months passed, bringing the warmth of summer to Riverdale. The Miller property had transformed in subtle ways. A tall fence now enclosed the spacious backyard. A professional-grade dog obstacle course occupied one corner, and a handmade sign reading "Rex's Kingdom" hung from the large oak tree where Sophie spent hours reading aloud to her constant companion. On this particular Sunday morning, Frank sat on the porch swing, coffee mug in hand, watching his niece and Rex navigate the obstacle course for what must have been the 20th time that week. The German Shepherd moved with remarkable agility, his once broken leg showing barely a hint of stiffness as he sailed over jumps and weaved through poles at Sophie's direction. "Left tunnel. Rex," Sophie called, pointing with the confidence of a seasoned handler. Without hesitation, Rex charged through the fabric tunnel, emerging with what could only be described as a doggy grin. Ears perked forward in anticipation of his next command. Frank marveled at the transformation in both of them. Sophie, once silent and withdrawn, now chattered constantly, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. And Rex, the broken, bloodied animal she'd found in the woods, had blossomed into a magnificent dog whose intelligence and loyalty drew admiration from everyone who met him. The sound of tires on gravel announced Martha Wilson's arrival. The veterinarian had become a regular visitor, documenting Rex's recovery for a case study she was preparing on the rehabilitation of fighting dogs. Today, she wasn't alone. Agent Lauren Parker stepped from the passenger side, looking decidedly less official in jeans and a casual blouse than she had during those intense days of the investigation. "Uncle Frank," Sophie called, spotting the visitors. Agent Parker came back. She raced toward the driveway, Rex loping gracefully at her side. "I promised I would," Lauren said, smiling as she knelt to greet Sophie. "And I brought something for you and Rex." She reached into her shoulder bag and pulled out an official-looking document in a frame. "This just came through yesterday. It's Rex's full adoption certificate and his certification as a therapy dog in training." Sophie's eyes widened as she accepted the frame. "Rex is officially mine." "All yours," Lauren confirmed. "The court finalized everything last week, and the therapy dog certification means he can start visiting hospitals and schools once he completes his final training." Frank joined them, extending a hand to Lauren. "This means a lot." "Thank you." Lauren shook his hand warmly. "Rex earned it, and so did Sophie." She glanced toward the house. "Is Sheriff Taylor here yet? I have updates on the case I'd like to share with both of you." As if on cue, Dave's cruiser pulled up behind Martha's station wagon. The sheriff emerged carrying a bakery box, his expression more relaxed than Frank had seen it in months. "Brought those cinnamon rolls you like, Soph?" Dave called. "Figured we might have something to celebrate today." Inside, around the kitchen table that had become the central gathering place for their expanding circle, Lauren shared the latest developments in the case against Calvin Reed and his associates. "Reed's trial date is set for October," she reported, accepting a mug of coffee from Frank. "With the evidence we've gathered and the testimony from his associates who've taken plea deals, the prosecutor is confident of a conviction on all counts, including Abigail's murder." Dave nodded, his expression somber but satisfied. Rayburn's testimony was the final nail. He gave a full confession about tampering with Abigail's car on Reed's orders. Even Reed's high-priced lawyers can't spin that away. Frank felt a complex wave of emotions wash over him. Grief for his sister, relief that her killers would face justice, pride in her determination to expose the truth. Beneath the table, Rex moved to press against his leg, as if sensing his distress. The German Shepherd had developed an uncanny ability to detect emotional shifts, offering comfort with his steady presence. "There's more," Lauren continued, her expression brightening. "The 3 other police dogs we rescued from Reed's property, they're all making remarkable progress at the rehabilitation center. One of them, a Belgian Malinois named Cody, has already been placed with a retired K9 handler in Wyoming. The other 2 are still in specialized training, but their prognosis is good." "Because of Rex," Sophie said proudly, her hand resting on her dog's broad head. "He showed them the way." Martha, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "That reminds me, I've had 4 inquiries this week from families interested in adopting rescue dogs. Ever since the story about Sophie and Rex hit the newspapers, People seem more open to the idea that these animals deserve a second chance. The story had indeed spread far beyond Riverdale's boundaries. A reporter from the regional paper had written a feature that was picked up by national outlets, captivating readers with its tale of a small girl's extraordinary courage and a fighting dog's remarkable journey to becoming a beloved pet. Letters and emails poured in from across the country, many accompanied by donations for Martha's emergency medical fund for abused animals. "Which reminds me," Lauren said, reaching into her bag again, "I've been collecting these for you. Sophie." She handed over a thick envelope. "These are letters from children around the country who read about you and Rex. They've been sending them to our office, and I thought you might like to read them." Sophie accepted the envelope with wide eyes. "People wrote to me." "Lots of people," Lauren confirmed. "You've become something of a hero to kids who love animals. And to adults, too." Sophie carefully opened the envelope and pulled out the stack of letters, some written in careful, childish print, others typed, many adorned with colorful drawings of girls and dogs. One letter on top, written in shaky handwriting, caught Frank's attention. "That one's special," Lauren said, noticing his interest. "It's from an 82-year-old woman in Florida who used to train search and rescue dogs. She said Sophie's story gave her hope for the next generation." As Sophie began sifting through the letters with amazement, Dave turned the conversation back to business. "What about the larger investigation? Any progress on the other players in Reed's network?" Lauren's expression grew serious. "That's actually the other reason I'm here. Based on the evidence we gathered in Riverdale, we've executed search warrants in 3 states. So far, we've shut down 4 more fighting operations and rescued 26 dogs. The political connections are proving complicated, but we're making progress there too." "The judge in Montana?" Frank asked, remembering Dave's earlier revelations. "Under investigation by the Judicial Ethics Committee," Lauren confirmed. "And the police chief in Idaho has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of our investigation." Martha shook her head in disgust. "I still can't believe how many supposedly respectable people were involved in something so cruel." "Money and power," Dave said grimly. "Tale as old as time." "But so is courage and doing what's right," Frank countered, glancing toward the living room where Sophie now sat on the floor with Rex, reading the letters aloud to him. The German shepherd listened with his head tilted, seemingly absorbing every word. "Sometimes it just takes one person to start the change." Later, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, the adults moved to the porch while Sophie continued her training session with Rex. The German shepherd performed each command flawlessly, his focus on the child absolute despite the distractions of birds and squirrels that would have tempted a lesser dog. "Dr. Winters says Rex has exceptional potential as a therapy dog," Martha remarked, watching the pair. "His intelligence, combined with his remarkable sensitivity to emotional cues, makes him a natural. She thinks his experiences actually enhanced his empathy, if that's possible." "I believe it," Frank replied. Yesterday, Sophie had a nightmare, first one in weeks. Before I could even get to her room, Rex was there, lying beside her bed, licking her hand until she calmed down. It's like he knows exactly what she needs. Lauren nodded thoughtfully. We see that sometimes in dogs who've been through trauma, once they're rehabilitated, they develop an almost supernatural ability to connect with humans experiencing similar distress. It's why some of our rescue dogs make the best therapy animals for veterans with PTSD or children who've experienced abuse. Speaking of which, Dave interjected, the school board approved your proposal. Frank, Rex can start visiting the elementary school this fall as part of their emotional support program, once he finishes his certification. Frank smiled, remembering how nervous he'd been presenting the idea to the board that a former fighting dog could help children struggling with emotional and behavioral issues. But the evidence was too compelling to ignore, especially when Sophie herself had stood before them, explaining with simple eloquence how Rex had helped her find her voice again. He'll be working with other kids like me, Sophie had told the board. The kids who are scared or sad or can't talk about their feelings. Rex understands because he was hurt too, but he learned to trust again, and he can help them learn that too. In the yard, Sophie had moved on from formal commands to a game of fetch, throwing a tennis ball that Rex joyfully retrieved. Her laughter carried across the property a sound that, months ago, Frank had feared he might never hear again. You know, Martha said softly, in all my years of veterinary practice, I've seen countless animals overcome terrible circumstances. But Rex and Sophie, they're something special. They didn't just survive, they transformed each other. Frank nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. He thought of Abigail, wondered what she would think of her daughter now, this brave, compassionate child who had carried a wounded dog through the forest and, in doing so, had helped bring down the criminal enterprise that had taken her mother's life. As if sensing the emotional current of Frank's thoughts, Rex paused in his play, turning to look directly at the porch. Then, deliberately, he picked up his tennis ball and trotted to where Frank sat, placing the slobbery offering directly in his lap. I think that's an invitation. Lauren laughed as Frank made a face at the wet ball. Go on, Martha encouraged. Doctor's orders playtime is good therapy for humans, too. Frank set down his coffee mug and rose from his chair. What do you say? Soph room for one more in your game. Sophie's face lit up. Come on, Uncle Frank, I'll show you how Rex can catch the ball in midair. As Frank stepped into the yard, joining the circle of joy created by a small girl and her remarkable dog, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since Abigail's death. The path forward was clear now, not without challenges, certainly, but illuminated by the extraordinary bond between Sophie and Rex, a connection forged in trauma but blossoming into something beautiful and healing, in a town once shadowed by secrets and silence. A little girl and a rescued dog had shown everyone the transformative power of courage, compassion, and second chances, and in their simple, daily interactions, the training sessions, the quiet moments of comfort, the exuberant play, they continued to remind Riverdale of the very best possibilities of the human-animal bond. Throw it high, Uncle Frank, Sophie called, her voice strong and clear in the summer air. Rex can jump really far now. Frank tossed the ball in a high arc, watching as Rex launched himself skyward, a perfect embodiment of joy and resilience, with Sophie cheering him on every step of the way. Folks, the story of little Sophie and Rex reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope finds a way. Remember when we were young and believed in the goodness of people? This child carried a wounded dog for miles because she refused to accept that suffering was someone else's problem. In a world where it's easier to look away, she looked directly into pain and said, "I will help," just like the values our parents instilled in us. Rex's journey from fighting pit to therapy dog mirrors our own resilience, the way we've weathered life's storms and emerged stronger. Many of us understand loss, like Frank losing his sister, and know the healing that comes from purpose. When Sophie found her voice again through loving that broken dog, wasn't that just like the redemption we've sought in our own lives? This story touches us because it reflects what we know to be true, that compassion isn't weakness, that standing up for the vulnerable matters, and that healing happens in unexpected ways. In a community restored by a child's courage and a dog's loyalty, we see the America we've always believed in, one where ordinary people doing extraordinary things reminds us who we truly are.